Let's look now at the different economic systems that we see comprising a key aspect of a nation's political economy. There are three broad types of economic systems that we're going to look at here today. The first is a market economy, and no, we're not talking about this type of market where Conde works. We're talking about capitalist economies. This is where all productive activities are privately owned and production is determined, and indeed prices are determined by the interaction of the forces of supply and demand. Government encourages free and fair competition between private producers in market economies. So you can see here that there are quite clear links to individual societies where we're encouraging the maximisation of individual self-wealth. And also democratic nations. You can see that shining through here as well, this idea that there should be fair and free competition amongst private producers. The opposite of market economies are command economies, which are linked to communism and socialism. This is where the government plans the goods and services that the company chooses to produce, the quantity that they produce, and also the prices at which they are sold. So all businesses are state-owned or government-owned, and it's the governments who allocate resources for what is deemed to be the good of society. As you can imagine, that involves a fairly subjective judgment a fair degree of the time, and as not surprisingly, perhaps as a result, we've seen a significant reduction in the number of command economies around the world. Most of them are moving more towards a market-based economy rather, given that the idea of making as much money as you can is a much simpler goal than trying to work out what actually is the greatest good for society overall. You can also see some quite clear links here to collectivism and totalitarianism. Certainly it prioritises in command economies this idea of the good of society, the greater good for the collective rather than the individual, and certainly the idea that the government, in this case, should be the ruling party to control most of these major decisions rather than the individuals or the business owners. The third type of economic system are called mixed economies. And this is where certain sectors of the economy are left to private ownership and free market mechanisms, while others have significant government ownership and planning. Governments tend to own most of the firms that are considered important to national security. So a lot of defence-based industries in mixed economies are still owned by the governments, and a number of others that are deemed so important that they cannot simply be left in private hands, otherwise, in case they are not used and sort of run as efficiently and as properly in the greater interest of this society as they should be. Certainly we've seen a significant rise in the number of mixed economies over the last few decades as more and more command economies shift towards a more capitalist perspective. Alright, the final component of any nation's political economy is the legal system that is in place, and this refers to the rules that regulate behaviour, along with the processes by which the laws are enforced and through which redress for grievances may be obtained. So clearly here the focus is on different types of law, and unfortunately we're not talking about this type of law, or more in line with your Judge Judy style. Okay, maybe not quite Judge Judy, but you get the point. And there are three types of legal systems that we're going to focus on today, and the most commonly found within the international business. The first is common law, which is based on tradition, precedent and customs. Civil law, which is based on detailed sets of laws organised into codes. And finally, theocratic law, which is based on religious teachings. Let's go through each of these in turn. Alright, common law, unfortunately, has nothing to do with my man Common, who is a rapper if you're not familiar with his work. It is instead a system that evolved in England over hundreds of years and is used widely in the UK and many of its former and current colonies. So the US, Canada, Australia and a number of Asian nations do employ common law. It tends to be based on cumulative wisdom of judges and precedent. It relies heavily on the judgments of its judges, who effectively act as neutral referees and have the power to interpret the law so that it applies to the unique circumstances of an individual case. So it's very much based around the idea that a judge will preside over a particular case. They will look at the set of circumstances and then look at what has occurred in the past in terms of previous rulings and try and identify sort of trends or similar cases so that they can then apply their judgment that was passed down from the previous similar case into this particular current set of circumstances. The judgments of the judges themselves are supplemented by statutory laws, which are additional laws which effectively guide their decision making and their judgments that they are able to make. But certainly the main focus here is on the precedent as set by previous cases and the consequential judgment, the wisdom-based judgments of the judges. Civil law, on the other hand, is the most common form of a legal system and is certainly prevalent in more than 80 countries around the world today. So a lot of European nations like Germany, France and Russia have adopted a civil law system. Unlike common law, it is very much based on the codification of a very detailed set of laws. There isn't such room for judgment by the judges who preside over cases. Instead, they basically just apply the laws that are set in place, that are typically very detailed, rather than needing to interpret it based on tradition, precedent or custom. So there isn't that need to do that, because typically in a civil law-based system there is a hugely detailed, comprehensive set of laws which basically cover any potential set of circumstances. So when a case arises, the judges typically just look at what the laws say and apply that to the particular situation, rather than needing to make a particular judgment based on what has happened in the past. The final legal system that we're going to look at today is theocratic law. This is prevalent in some Middle Eastern nations like Iran and Saudi Arabia, and also some African nations like Nigeria, which are typically bound by strong Islamic faith. Most of the time when we talk about theocratic law systems, we discuss and focus on Islamic-based faith or nations that follow Islam. It's typically based on official religious teachings and in turn guided by the moral behaviour relating to faith and practice. So whatever a particular religion decides or sees as being the appropriate course of action, and therefore the resulting laws, is what ends up being put in place. As I said before, Islamic law is by far the most widely practiced theocratic legal system in the modern world. And although we do see instances of Hindu, Jewish and Catholic law still being practiced today. So examples of nations like that governed by this man here, this is King Abdullah, who was the former king of Saudi Arabia, recently passed away, but certainly was very famous in his country and around the world for practicing and putting into place theocratic laws. But as I say, there are also additional religions which are, to a lesser extent perhaps, practiced and the dominant legal system in place around the world. A good example here is by this man. This is Pope Francis, who is the current head of the Catholic Church and the head of the state of the Vatican City, where he drives around in that bad boy, his current Pope-mobile. That is magnificent, isn't it? Kylie Jenner must be green, or perhaps in this case white, with envy.